Hey, we got a call about a male hitting a female and the two of them getting in this vehicle and taking off.
So I
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this first episode in a series analyzing the Moab incident in almost microscopic detail, in other words, a deep dive, we want to start off by looking at the bigger picture. So we're going smaller, but we're going to start off with the whole going smaller thing by starting with the bigger picture. We want to look at how things appear generally, then drill into the specifics. So generally, when the white van pulls up, the Ford Transit, two occupants are inside, two young people, a couple, and the person on the passenger seat is a very attractive 22-year-old who is clearly in distress. She's crying, and we'll return to her in a moment. But her companion, a not necessarily attractive 23-year-old, a sort of ordinary-looking 23-year-old, is sitting beside her, and he's not seemingly in any distress at all. He's not even distressed about his partner, his companion's distress. Specifically, we are looking at the events through two separate body cams. The first kicking off at 16 minutes to 5 in the afternoon, or 16:44, and the second, although nearer to the scene, commencing about 4 minutes later at 16:48, or 12 minutes to 5. So we'll start with the first body cam. It's 16:44, in other words, late afternoon on a hot day in the Moab region of Utah on August 12th, almost the middle of August. The 12th of August was actually the second hottest day in August, a scorching 98 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. The next day, Friday the 13th, would be even hotter, tying with the previous Friday as the hottest day of the month. Bottom line was, it was hot and likely very unpleasant in the van, very sticky, and probably also the same sort of thing in a tent without air conditioning. And this would have added to their stress. We know that part of why they were in the van at all, moving around when they were, was to get water. The other thing to note is that contextually, Brian was driving. Brian was actually fleeing the scene, and Brian was also speeding. One could ask the same question here as we asked following his departure from the Spread Creek camp 2 weeks later, as well as from his parents' home about 2 weeks after that. Why was he running away from the authorities or trying to evade them if he didn't do anything wrong? Also, during the first instance, Gabby was punching Brian in an effort to get him to obey the law. I'm not sure how that can be seen in isolation as Gabby simply hitting Brian, but essentially she was trying to force him into doing the right thing. Now let's deal with the actual body cam, and we're going to deal with 3 minutes of the footage from the first body cam and a little bit from the second. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So from the first body cam, and I'll put a link to both body cam videos in the description, we get Officer Daniel Scott Robbins, who is actually referenced second in the police report, and even though he arrives on the scene first, he's actually responding to an incident at the Moonflower Co-op, where a male and female were observed to be arguing over a phone. Brian was observed getting into the van, and then Gabby hit Brian on the arm and climbed over him to get into the van. It's possible she hit him on the arm because she wanted that arm to hand her the keys, and he wouldn't. And she then climbed over him to get into the van, and it appeared to witnesses as if Gabby had been locked out of the van and was trying to get inside, and this was later corroborated by Gabby. So during Officer Robbins' pursuit, Brian was driving around 30 miles per hour above the speed limit. Officer Robbins activated his lights to initiate a stop, but instead of stopping, the van continued to move erratically, crossing the double yellow line at one point before abruptly swerving to the right.
Driver is showing some obscure driving, possibly intoxicated. Currently doing 45 miles an hour. Zone through here is 25. Oh! Subject just hit the curb. Correction, speed limit is...
So, did you catch that? About 30 seconds into the footage, Officer Robbins indicates that Brian is possibly intoxicated, Brian being the driver. He says, quote, driver is showing some obscure driving, possibly intoxicated. And, that is the very first reference to Brian, even though that Officer Robbins doesn't necessarily know who he was referring to. And think about this obscure driver and bizarre design. It almost sounds like the same thing. A few seconds later, the officer actually exclaims, he goes, oh, showing just how shocking, reckless, and disorderly the van was actually being driven. At about 50 seconds, the officer provides another voiceover. He says, subject has just hit the curb. So besides driving recklessly, besides speeding, the vehicle actually kind of has a kind of an impact. And that just shows you how bad things kind of were in terms of this pursuit. And so after that, Robbins activates his sirens and possibly lights as well. Robbins indicates his position as 3/4 of a mile from the Arches National Park, just before the gate. Within seconds of activating his sirens, the van stops, and so does Robbins. We're now at about 70 seconds in the footage, and what happens now, Robbins steps out of his vehicle and approaches the white Ford Transit van. Now, the interesting thing is, because the driver's side wheels are still sort of sticking out into the road, the officer approaches on the passenger side, Gabby's side, in other words. This appears to catch the passengers off guard. Gabby has to roll down the window, and it appears Brian's window was actually rolled down at that point. In any event, the officer basically addresses Gabby at first because she's more visible and closer and more accessible, while Brian is sort of hidden behind her, his head popping out slightly. It should be noted that in the police report, Brian is identified as the victim and Gabby as the suspect. Now, the vehicle is still running. That's the Ford Transit van. The brake lights still activated as Gabby rolls down the window. Brian's hiking bag can be seen above Gabby's left shoulder, as well as Gabby's wide-brimmed straw hat. Two yellow, sort of strange traffic devices are already in the road, perhaps used to discourage people from either stopping or turning into the arches on this particular road. I think this was more of an exit road than an entry road. Right in front of the vehicle is a no entry sign. So we're now at 90 seconds into the Bodycam, or halfway through our analysis of Bodycam 1. The officer seems taken aback by the youthfulness and fresh faces in front of him. It seems to make him relaxed and be quite calm and sort of even. Is sort of in a low stress scenario compared to what I guess it could have been. He's not dealing with anyone who's intoxicated. Also, the fact that Gabby's in tears seems to put the officer in a less confrontational kind of mindset. He's sort of got this easy manner about him. The officer, after having Brian place the keys on the dash in front of him, asks for their names. This is where it first becomes obvious that Gabby is upset, clearly upset, and Brian seems to be smiling. Brian seems to be okay. He waves to the officer saying, I'm Brian.
You want to place your vehicle into park and go ahead and turn it off for me?
Yeah, sure.
No, park?
Oh, it is in park, yeah.
Okay, turn off your engine. Go ahead and set your keys on the dash for me, all right? What's your guys' names?
Gabby.
I'm Brian.
Gabby, Brian? Okay. What's going on? How come you're crying?
I'm sorry, we've just been fighting this morning. Some personal issues.
It was a long day. We were camping yesterday and camping.
So to review that, at 1 minute 42 seconds, the officer asks Gabby in an immediately conciliatory tone, "What's going on? How come you're crying?" And Gabby answers, "I'm not crying. We've just been fighting this morning, some personal issues." Brian then interrupts her, saying, "It's been a long day. We were camping yesterday, and camping got some supplies and stuff." And then he points to the curb, I guess, in front of them and says, I'm sorry I hit the bump there," and then sort of laughs.
And got the stuff, supplies and stuff. I'm sorry I hit the bump there.
I was distracting him from driving. I'm sorry.
So at this point, Gabby doesn't really know what this is all about. Brian doesn't either. And I think they're sort of both assuming that it's got something to do with the way he was driving. It's got something to do with traffic. Is this a traffic officer? And I think it's interesting how Gabby, straight off the bat, is quite authentic, saying why she's crying. She says it's because they've been fighting. That's originally how she answers, right? She says, it's the sort of fifth or sixth word in her answer. She says, "We've just been fighting this morning, some personal issues," right? So she's quite authentic, and then Brian jumps in to sort of minimize everything, suddenly explaining that Gabby's crying because it's been a long day. He says, "It's been a long day and we were camping yesterday. Is that why she's crying?" So he's sort of minimizing everything, suddenly explaining that Gabby's crying because it's been a long day, and then apologizing for something else, for his driving. It's also interesting that Gabby refers to fighting this morning when clearly the argument that precipitated the intervention in Moab happened in the late afternoon. In other words, immediately there's a very different version of events. There's a contradiction. Gabby goes on to say, "I was distracting him, I'm sorry." Gabby, taking her cue from Brian, seems to think the officer is upset about a driving problem. It's also not strictly true to say she was distracting Brian. Brian, from the officer's perspective, wasn't driving like someone who was simply distracted. He was speeding. You know, you don't drive at that speed because you're distracted. And he seemed to be driving like a drunk driver with the police on his tail. Neither Gabby nor Brian make a reference to what has happened between them at the Moonflower Co-op. And if you read the police report, that is why the officer's there. Someone called in an incident at the Moonflower Co-op, and Officer Robbins is responding to that, and now is asking them what is going on, and they're not really referring to that. So in a weird way, the officer's catching them out, both of them. But to be fair, Gabby has actually made a broad allusion to it, saying they've been fighting, which is true, they've just been fighting. And Brian has done the same by referring to sort of getting supplies. That's where they've just come from. But it's not enough to satisfy the officer. It's not, they haven't really told him enough to address his question. And so the officer says,
"Can I get you to step out of the vehicle for me, man?"
Yeah.
So you might not think so, but this was a critical moment. The officer is not satisfied with the explanation he's been given, and he asks Gabby to step out of the vehicle. And now we're at 2 minutes through this 3-minute segment, and Gabby kind of lets out a broken here and sort of lets out a sob. And then Robbins addresses Brian, and he tells him, "Just hang tight right there." He says, "Do you mind if I take your keys and put them on the hood?" And Brian says, "Okay, buddy, I'm so sorry." And then Robbins says, "Oh no, you're fine." Robbins is a little concerned that Brian might drive off. Gabby opens the door, careful to avoid the 2 yellow traffic cones.
"Just hang tight right there. Do you mind if I take your keys and just put them on your hood?"
You got it, buddy. I'm so
Thank
sorry.
you. Oh, no, you're fine.
Why did Robbins ask Gabby, who wasn't driving, to step out of the vehicle? And did Robbins suspect that Gabby's emotions were part of the problem? Because clearly she's emotional here and Brian isn't. And Robbins saying to Brian, "You're okay," suggests he may already be gravitating towards Gabby being the culprit. Bear in mind, this is what is eventually written in the report, that Brian is the victim and Gabby is the suspect. There is also some symbolism in the officer targeting a particular person. Whether or not he consciously felt that Gabby was the one in the wrong, and the fact that he separated her first, I think suggests to her, also suggests to Brian, and perhaps indirectly, subconsciously to himself, that something was wrong on Gabby's side. It could also be that he felt Gabby was the victim at this point and wanted her away from Brian for her safety, which is after all how things ultimately played out, right? So at this point, the officer and we, the audience, get our first good look at Gabby. Aside from her distress, she's dressed well, she's clean, she's tanned and toned. She appears fit and healthy and is polite and comes across as sincere and well-mannered, if emotional. In the background of the above screen grab, you can actually see Brian leaning forward to see what's happening. Interestingly, at this point, he hasn't said a word to Gabby on camera, nor her to him. And there's also no messages of support. It'll be okay, or don't worry, or stay calm. Officer Robbins closes the van door and motions with a gloved hand for Gabby to move away so they can speak privately. Gabby, still sniveling and stressed, complies.
I'm going to go ahead and close your door. Okay. Why don't you come over here? SO229, I have the female that was on the passenger seat separated from the male. Keys are on the hood. You want to tell me what's wrong?
Yeah, I don't know. It's just some days.
So at this point, we've got 21 seconds remaining in this segment, but it's also very important to slow it down and see what we're talking about. So Gabby has her hand over her mouth as she walks to the officer's cruiser. In the rear footage, where basically by that I mean where you see footage of Gabby from behind, it can actually be appreciated just how slim and slight Gabby is. To the left of them are a number of buildings. Perhaps the park entrance and several shops can be seen, and Officer Robbins communicates the status of the situation, simply stating that he's separated the female from the male. What I also think is interesting is, and I could be wrong about this, but weren't Gabby and Brian, if this incident didn't happen, weren't they on the way to the Arches Park? And so why did Brian pass the entrance, or am I incorrect about that? Is the entrance further along the road, or did he actually pass the entrance, which begs the question, where was he going? With the police behind him, what is the plan, kind of thing. Anyway, from this position in the sun, it can also be observed that Gabby's wearing a tight, almost see-through brown top. And one wonders whether Brian disapproved of her clothing on this day, or whether someone else noticed Gabby and this upset him. And then Robbins, who's still transmitting, says the keys are on the hood, and then he says to Gabby, you want to tell me what's going on? And this is a very important moment, 2 minutes and 34 seconds, 234, into almost 80 minutes of body cam. What's just happened is the officer hasn't really accepted either Brian's or Gabby's versions of events while sitting side by side, while next to one another inside the van. Now he's actually separated the two. Obviously, he's found Gabby in a state of distress, so that's probably also been an important reason for him doing that. But he's also making sure that Brian can't hear what they're saying. He's discreetly asking Gabby a second time, basically repeating the first question, wanting to know what is going on. Just tell me what is going on. And look at Gabby's face right here. Because Gabby knows what is going on, it's another thing for her to say what is actually going on. And what the officer can't understand is, why is Gabby so emotional given what is actually being said? It doesn't really match up. Does that make sense? So in other words, something is missing. And so when he asks her, what is going on, she sort of leans forward, and even her movements are quite erratic. She leans forward, then she leans back, puts her arms behind her back, gestures towards Brian, gestures back. And she kind of says, I don't know. Some days straightens up, motions towards Brian, ties her hair behind her and says, I have really bad OCD. And again, this is not really answering the question. Is that why you're crying? Are you crying because you have very bad OCD, or are you crying because something else happened? And the answer is because something else happened. But the problem is the officers aren't getting to the actual answer, right? And immediately Robbins, sounding apologetic, says, okay.
You want to tell me what's going on?
Yeah, I don't know. It's just some days I have really bad OCD, and
Okay.
I was just cleaning and straightening up the back of the van before, and I was apologizing to him and saying, I'm sorry that I'm so mean, because sometimes I have OCD and sometimes I just get really frustrated. I'm not like mean towards him. I just like, I guess my vibe is like I am like in a bad mood.
Okay, so that has brought us to the 3-minute mark. So I'm not going to play any more from Bodycam 1. But basically what happens here is Gabby says, sometimes I have OCD and sometimes I can get really frustrated, not like mean towards him, motioning to Brian. And it's a pity that the officer didn't really pay attention to that, because it's true. She wasn't being mean towards Brian, whereas it feels like Brian was being mean towards her, right? Taking the keys and not letting her into the van is a form of coercion, right? The other thing is she said that she apologized to Brian for being OCD, and then she talks about some other things, which we'll get to in the next episode. But you can already see that Gabby's still not really answering the officer's question. To answer the question, she'd be referring to the incident in front of the Moonflower Co-op. That's really what he wants to know about. She is, in a manner of speaking, describing herself as the problem, sort of suggesting that she was in a bad mood, but it's not really clear what she's saying, except that she's been sort of mean to Brian. That's sort of what comes across. Is that really the case, though? Once again, Gabby's sort of avoiding the question with a neither here nor there answer. Had she told the truth in the first few seconds, that Brian had hit her and she had hit Brian, one wonders how things would have turned out that afternoon, and whether the fates turned on that question. In my personal opinion, it's far worse Brian hitting her than her hitting him, even if the law states that it regards it equally. So the law might say that her hitting him and him hitting her is the same, that they're both liable legally in the same way. In my personal opinion, it's far worse a male hitting a female. In hindsight, we know who was in real danger in regards to Gabby and Brian. And that brings us now to the second body cam. The second body cam kicks off just 4 minutes after the first, shortly after the point where we've just stopped our analysis above, where Gabby and Officer Robbins are both at their vehicle talking. I'm not going to analyze much here, except to point out that Officer Eric Pratt, whose narrative appears first in the police report, approaches Brian on the traffic side of the vehicle, that's the driver's side, but doesn't spend very much time there because it isn't safe, and for a couple of other reasons that I'll get into. Also, Brian is able to transfer the conversation from Officer Pratt to another officer on the passenger side who arrived seconds before Pratt. His vehicle can actually be seen turning in front of the van. Now, according to Pratt's report, a male and female had left the scene where the disorderly conduct occurred. Pratt noted in his report that it wasn't clear, but it seemed that a male had been observed assaulting a female. Pratt also heard Robbins say over the radio that he'd seen the white van leave its lane and strike the curb before stopping near the entrance to the park. Strangely, Pratt's report is incredibly vague and ends almost as it starts. He writes, for example, I arrived on scene and observed as 2 park officers also arrived. I assisted Officer Robbins with his investigation until I was called away to a report of an intoxicated male near blah, blah, blah. And, he almost ends his description the moment it begins. Anyway, at about 23 seconds into Officer Pratt's body cam, we see Officer Robbins talking to Gabby beside his vehicle. At this stage, the third officer's vehicle is parked parallel to the van but facing the opposite direction. At 32 seconds, Officer Pratt reaches Brian's door. The window is open when he says,
How's it going?
How are you doing?
Good. Hey, we got a call about a male hitting a female and the two of them getting in this vehicle and taking off.
So I just.
So, in case you missed that, he says, "How's it going?" And Brian answers, "How are you doing?" He doesn't actually say how he is doing. Pratt says, "Good." And as Pratt starts talking to Brian, it's quite unfortunate. Another officer leans in from the passenger side and basically fragments this all-important first encounter, this first meeting, this first impression. And so at 33 seconds, the officer continues, "Hey, we got a call about a male hitting a female and the two of them getting in this vehicle and taking off." And Brian immediately looks away to the other officer who hasn't said anything to him. You know, Officer Pratt is waiting for an answer from Brian to this really critical question, and it is the critical question. It is the critical question, and instead of Brian answering it, he looks to the other officer who hasn't said anything to him and addresses him saying, sorry, stutters and says, "I don't want to try to defend myself." Now he's addressing the officer on the other side by saying anything, but I pushed her away. Then he looks back at the original officer. In other words, after he says, "I pushed her away," he looks back to the original officer. Then he says, "She gets really worked up, and when she does, she swings. And she had her cell phone in her hand, so I just tried to get her away," right? Now, if you take that statement, look how much he's talking about Gabby, right? She gets worked up, she swings, she had her cell phone in her hand, and I just tried to get it away. Now think about what Gabby said about everything. She called herself OCD. She doesn't really say anything about Brian initially. So in an instant, Brian has blamed Gabby for getting upset and swinging at him. All he did was push her away from him, and he seems to be conveying that he did so gently. But that's not what the witness reported. And who was just swinging on the road and driving over the speed limit? At this point, 51 seconds into Brian's brief statement, Officer Robbins actually returns to the passenger window and Brian leans over to address his question, leaving Officer Pratt with sort of dead air. So Officer Pratt then heads over to Gabby to get her version of events. In total, the interrogation of Brian by Pratt lasts 20 seconds, and much of Brian's answer is distorted or fragmented by him turning away and talking to 2, then 3 officers on opposite sides of the vehicle. And that brings us to my conclusion. Brian should have been asked to get out of the vehicle as soon as Officer Pratt arrived on the scene. Ideally, Officer Robbins should have confronted Brian first as well, because it may just have given Brian the opportunity, while Gabby was spoken to first, that the optics suggested that she was responsible when she wasn't. Brian was certainly more responsible for the incident than those on the scene perceived it to be, and from this moment on, he played these perceptions to his advantage. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I am going to be doing a live stream. I plan to do it at 6 or 7 o'clock EST, Eastern Standard Time tonight. I don't know how long this video is going to take. The fact that it's almost 30 minutes long may mean I'm not going to be able to do the live. If I can finish it up early, then I will do it live tonight. Otherwise, I'll do it tomorrow. And the topic is Brian Laundrie's animal nature, specifically following on with the analysis we've done previously on the psychological life of Brian. So look out for that. It might be up later this evening, depending on how quickly I can edit this video. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.